There are so many ways you can make mistakes with your knitting, and when it comes to sweater knitting specifically, there are 5 things I see pop up very often when it comes to knitting sweaters. So we're going to talk about those 5 things. So get your knitting and a drink and let's settle in for a good knit and chat. And thank you to Craftsy for sponsoring this video, but more about them in a little bit. Hey Nerdy Knitter, Tanya here. I'm a certified knitting instructor and a master hand knitter, and I believe knitting is a form of self-care. You can take time for yourself and your creative hobbies like knitting and still create beautiful things that you love to wear. And one of those things that we love to knit and to wear is sweaters. And in my experience with helping knitters knit sweaters, there are some things that seem to pop up a lot. So I want to tackle like the 5 most common issues that I often see and how you can avoid them. And then I also have a few comments from you as well. I asked about your tips and advice for knitting sweaters, and you had some great tips to share. So those are going to be sprinkled throughout this video as well. So let's start with the most common issue, and that seems to be choosing the right size. Now, it might actually surprise you to know that you could knit probably a couple different sizes in most patterns, and they would fit you just fine. What would change is the amount of ease. Now, if we're going to just define that really quickly, ease is just the amount of space between the garment and your body. Say a sock, you want it to have some negative ease, so it will be smaller than your foot. So when you pull it over your foot, it's going to stay in place. The same thing if you wear like a tank top or a camisole underneath your clothing, you might want that to be smaller than your body, so it has negative ease, so it will stretch and fit and stay in place. On the other hand, you might have a favorite t-shirt that you love to wear to bed that's really oversized, that has a lot of positive ease because it's bigger than your body. Or maybe you like to snuggle up in your husband's old sweatshirt, and that probably has a lot of positive ease because it's bigger than your body. One of the first things I see when it comes to sizing is, for women especially, they overestimate how much ease they want in their sweater because they think, I don't want anything tight fitting, so I'm going to choose lots of ease. Then it's just too big all over and it looks kind of messy and sloppy. So that's the first problem with sizing. But even when you choose the right size, you could probably choose 1 or 2 sizes in a pattern that would fit you well. You might fit one that has just a couple of inches of positive ease, so it fits like a standard, what they call average fit according to the Craft Yarn Council. Or maybe you'll knit something with 4 to 6 inches of positive ease, and that gives you sort of going into the oversized fit territory. But it's not super oversized, so it still fits your body. And a lot of patterns, not all the time, but in general, they are probably written in about 4-inch increments between each bust size, pretty much. So you could choose one that's fairly close to your bust and have pretty close to like no ease, or maybe just a bit of positive ease, or choose a size that's a little larger and have more positive ease. So that's the first thing. You could choose probably a couple different sizes and they would fit you just fine. But the issue often comes is women overestimate how much ease they want and they end up choosing a size with way too much ease for their body. I have another video that goes more in depth in this topic about like the difference between your body measurement and the garment measurements, the finished measurements of the pattern, and how to choose the right amount of ease. So I'll link to that. But another thing to consider is what you already wear. Pull out the things that you always gravitate towards. I mean, a lot of the time we probably have like a couple t-shirts that we just wear over and over. Pull them out and actually measure them and compare them to your body measurements to see how much ease you actually like in your garments. It might be less than you think it is. And one other note about ease, don't be scared of a little bit of negative ease. There is nothing wrong with a tiny bit. Now, I know a lot of the times we don't want negative ease like around our hips or our stomach. I don't mean there. Well, a tiny bit at the hips isn't bad because it will keep your sweater in place, so it won't ride up or be kind of droopy looking. So a bit of negative ease at the hips or the bottom of the sweater isn't bad. It's also not a bad thing at your full bust. If you think your bust is a curve, so the whole thing doesn't have to be like super tight negative ease, but just a tiny bit right at the highest, the apex of your bust is not a bad thing. So it's okay to actually choose a size that would give you just a bit of negative ease at the bust. That leads me to mistake number 2, and that is using the wrong measurements to choose the right size to knit. So once you've considered the potential sizes that you might knit, and usually that's based on your full bust, you should also consider your upper torso measurement, especially if you are larger than a C cup and up. C cup is kind of at the iffy place. You can get away with some of a bit of negative ease at the full bust, and the pattern should be just fine for you. Anything larger than that, you want to use an upper torso measurement. If you're smaller than a C cup, just use your bust measurement. That's going to be absolutely fine and give you a good relation to like the width of your shoulders. Unless you have broad shoulders, then you probably also want to use your upper torso measurement, because that's more related to your shoulder width, because shoulders, your skeleton, your ribs, your frame, that's all like bone measurements. Like those aren't going to change no matter how much your weight fluctuates. Your bust, on the other side, can fluctuate with age, with if you're having babies, or there's lots of things that can affect the size of your bust. And if it's just a couple inches different than your upper torso, which is what a B cup is, then you're totally fine. Knitting patterns are based on that average, that you're a B cup size. And of course, we are not all B cup sizes, but we'd have massive knitting patterns if they had to rewrite for every cup size. So the standard is just to use the average B cup, which means that there is about a 2-inch difference between the upper torso measurement and the full bust. To measure your upper torso, it's just like measuring your waist or your hips. You just measure around that area, but you pull the tape measure around your back and right up into your underarm all the way to the front. Put your arms down and sort of snug it up, really snug it up. So you're avoiding any fat in that area and you're getting like a skeletal measurement. That's what you want to use. And this is what you can use if you are, C cup is iffy. That's up to you whether you want to go with just use the pattern as it is and maybe have a bit of negative ease at the full bust, or use your upper torso measurement as the guide. So what that will do is it'll give you a better fitting sweater through your shoulders. Especially this also applies if you have broad shoulders. You use that upper torso measurement because that's more closely related to like the width of your shoulders compared to your bust, which, you know, you could have broad shoulders and be an A cup. You could have broad shoulders and be like a double D cup. And that upper torso measurement will give you a better framework to start with. So that would be the second mistake, is which measurement to choose. And another thing I've not often, but I have seen, is sometimes designers or people will recommend picking a pattern based on your widest point, whether that's your bust or your stomach or your hips. That's not a good thing, because those are all measurements that can change and fluctuate based on the amount of fat that is distributed to those areas. What doesn't change is your skeletal frame, your structure. So that's why we use that upper torso measurement to get a more exact picture of your actual frame, because you want the sweater to fit through the shoulders and the arms. You don't want it to be too big so it's falling off your shoulders, which is what happens sometimes if you're larger than a C cup. And the bigger the difference between your upper torso and your full bust, the messier or more oversized that sweater can look, because it's just too big in the neckline and the shoulders. So it's better if you're broad-shouldered or if you're larger than a C cup to use that upper torso measurement instead of the full bust measurement. So that leads to people asking, so what do I do if my bust, what do I do for those other areas like my full bust? Because that sweater is going to be too tight. This is when you have to look at other modifications. Once you get a base size that's going to fit you through the shoulders, then you can do things like a short row bust dart or waist shaping, or all the other modifications that you can make to make the sweater fit those other areas. But you want to choose a good base size that's going to fit in the shoulders first. And then you can add increases and decreases and short rows for extra shaping to those areas that you need them. But it starts with choosing a good size for your frame. And sometimes that means not using your full bust measurement. I have a full video on different ways you can add some bust shaping if you need it. So once you've chosen a base size that's going to fit you well through the shoulders, there's lots of ways you can add extra fabric for a really full bust. So I'll link to that video as well, so you can watch that to think about the different ways. And it really depends on the specific sweater your knitting. Like you might want one type of extra bust shaping in a set-in sleeve sweater. You might want something completely different in a top-down raglan, but there are lots of ways to add some extra fabric. And also, when I talk about like this for the bust shaping, this would also work for other areas that can be larger or smaller, like bellies or hips or things like that. Then you can also do different things like these bust adjustments for those areas too. So it's worth watching that video, even if a large bust isn't your issue, but something else might be. So those are the two biggies, I think, is just choosing the right size and using the right measurements on your body to choose the right size. So you can actually probably knit a couple different sizes in a pattern and they would both work absolutely fine depending on how much ease you want. One might be more oversized, one might be more fitted, but it really comes down to the second thing, which is choosing based on the right measurement for your body, which could be your full bust or it could be your upper torso. Now we do have a few more mistakes to discuss, but before we do, I just want to thank our sponsor for this video, Craftsy. We've been talking a lot about sweater knitting mistakes, but you know what isn't a mistake? A Craftsy membership. It's a great online platform filled with lots of wonderful classes for so many crafty hobbies like knitting, crochet, sewing, drawing, quilting, cake decorating, painting. There are just so many topics you can explore on there. It's one of my go-to places when I want to learn something new, whether it's knitting related or not. For knitting specifically, I can't even tell you how many classes I have watched, and I have not watched them all, but I've learned all about steeking and sock knitting and shawl construction and sweater fit. So many topics that I've explored and learned watching classes on Craftsy. One of my favorites that I've watched multiple times are the yarn dyeing classes with Sarah Eyre. I have learned to dye yarn and done this cardigan and this shawl, and I'm currently working on this shawl all with yarns that I dyed following the techniques in those classes. She has a wonderfully calm demeanor and she's just a really great teacher. So if you're interested in learning how to dye yarn, you want to check out those classes. Now there are still classes that I would love to take. The Zandy Peters Stacked Stitches class, or there's even one on sheep shearing that I didn't know I wanted to watch until now. But if you'd love to give Craftsy a try, then be sure to grab the link below the video. The first 1,000 people who sign up will get a full year's premium membership for just $1.49. So thank you to Craftsy for sponsoring this video. And now we have 3 more common mistakes that I often see when it comes to knitting sweaters. And you can probably guess this next one. Yeah, it's swatching. I know people don't like to swatch for whatever reason. I like to frame it as it's just more time to knit, and isn't that the point? We like to knit, yes? So swatching is just knitting. I know it feels more tedious because then you've got to like pull out your ruler or your tape measure and start counting stitches and rows and all of that. But I'll be the first to tell you, I don't always swatch. I don't swatch when I'm going to knit a pair of socks. But of course, those first few pairs of socks didn't fit anybody because I didn't know what needle size would be the best for the way I knit. So, but I was okay with having some socks that didn't fit. If I wasn't, then I would have had to spend some time swatching. Same goes for hats and shawls. I don't really swatch for them at all. But when it comes to something that I want to fit, especially when it's a sweater that I want to fit, that I'm going to spend weeks knitting, I'm going to swatch for that. Like, why would I spend weeks knitting a sweater only to find out that it's not going to fit me or whoever it's intended for? And I know people say your swatches lie. Yeah, they can, because you are encouraging them to lie. You don't make them large enough, and you don't take care of your swatch like you do your sweater. You can't just cast on 1 inch and keep it on the needles and measure a little bit and see that you have gauge. You actually have to knit a large swatch. I actually like to do it in 3 different needle sizes, all in one big swatch. Thanks to the master's program, that's what they had us do, and now that's sort of just a habit because it's a time saver to just do one swatch all at once with 3 different needle sizes, and then wash and block that swatch and take the measurements, and instead of doing one with 1 needle size, washing, blocking, taking measurements, finding out it's wrong and having to redo the whole thing again, just do 3 needle sizes all at once and just be done with it, and then you can just do the one swatch. But yes, if you want your sweater to fit, then you need to swatch, and it has to be large enough. So not just a little 4-inch swatch, make it at least 6 or 8 inches all the way around so you have plenty of room to measure. Measure the fullest width that you can. Don't just measure 4 inches. That's just an arbitrary number. probably based on the fact that knitting patterns were based in the UK first, which uses a metric system. So everything was based on 10 centimeters. So 4 inches is the equivalent to that in the US. So it's not like 4 inches is a magical number that you have to use. Measure the widest area possible. And also take those measurements before you wash and block that swatch. And when I mean wash and block, read the yarn label that you're going to use for your sweater. Take care of the sweater like the yarn label recommends. A lot of the time, if it's like an animal fiber, it's hand wash, dry flat. That's all I mean when I say wash and block. I'm not stretching out my swatch. I'm not pinning it. I'm not doing anything to it. I am just laying it flat in the shape it wants to be in and letting it dry. I'm taking measurements before I wash it, and I'm taking measurements after it's dry to see what the difference is, because there could be a big difference depending on the fiber content or if it's super wash or anything like that. You want to know how it's going to change and how it's going to grow. So take measurements before, take measurements after. And then you can, when you're knitting, and like right now, my pattern tells me I have to knit, I can't remember if it's like 17.5 inches in length. So I'm using my row gauge to figure that out. I'm not going to lay this down and measure it with a tape measure. I know what my row gauge is, so I measure that, I multiply that 17.5 by whatever my 1 inch row gauge is. So I know I have to work that many rows to get the length I want, because if the fabric really changes after washing, measuring while it's not been washed is not going to be helpful at all. And it's still on the needles. Like, you're not going to get an accurate measurement just laying it over my leg and trying to measure it, or it's just not accurate enough for that. Now, I can't force you to actually knit a swatch, but if you want your sweater to fit the way that you want it to fit, the best way to do that is by making a large swatch, getting that gauge information before and after blocking, and using that to guide your choices when it comes to the rest of the process and when it comes to knitting the actual garment, especially when it comes to knitting to certain lengths. You knit according to your post-block gauge measurements. And in the beginning, I said I had some comments from people, and those were a couple of the comments. Haley says, my advice would be no, really, you want to swatch. Trust me. Believe me, you really do. And then Nitty Linny, swatch and know your numbers, aka your measurements. I frogged a gorgeous colorwork sweater last year that was 95% finished because it was huge on me. I will reknit it when my heart heals and after I swatch. Yeah, you don't want to spend all your time knitting this beautiful garment that is not going to fit you. So take the extra night to knit a swatch, give it a couple days or a day to dry, and then you'll have better luck when it comes to knitting your sweater. And watch that video about swatching, especially if you think your gauge swatch lies to you. Watch that video and find out how you can make it be as honest as possible. And speaking of gauge, that leads us into mistake number 4, ignoring your row gauge. Row gauge is actually an important measurement. You can be bang on with stitch gauge, but your row gauge is probably going to be different than the designer's. Everybody knits differently, and you might have to use a different needle size than the designer of the pattern to get the right gauge. In most cases, the stitch gauge is the most important because that's what you need to get your circumferences, you know, like for the body and the sleeves, the circumference of the sweater. But that doesn't mean you should totally discount the row gauge. Now, this is a lot of the time the pattern will just tell you knit straight for X number of inches. This is when you just used your blocked gauge, your 1 inch row gauge, and you just use that. Multiply that measurement, whatever that measurement is, by your 1 inch row gauge, and that will tell me how many rows you have to knit to get that length for your finished garment. Even if it might look shorter or something like that, remember you still have to wash it and it might grow. So it's okay as long as you're using your gauge information. But this number is also important for other areas as well, especially when it comes to like the armhole depth of a sweater. When you have to knit like so much from, like if you're casting on, or if you're casting on at the top and working down to the armhole, then joining in the round to knit the rest of the body. Or if you're doing the reverse, you're starting at the bottom, working your way up to the armhole, and then you have to knit the rest, this area between the shoulder and the underarm. And if your row gauge is different and you just do what the pattern says according to, like if it tells you how many rows specifically, and let's say that you have more rows to the inch, that means it's going to be shorter. That armhole depth is going to be shorter than the designer intended. It's going to be tight up in your underarm. It's not going to be comfortable. Or you could have the reverse, where you have fewer rows in that gauge, in that inch of measurement, so that armhole is going to be longer, which can also be an issue. The longer it is, the harder it is to lift your arms, because your whole sweater is going to come up as well. You actually want that armhole in most standard sweaters to be pretty close to your underarm to begin with. You don't want it to be like stuck up in there so it's too tight, but you don't want it drooping way down either. You want it to look like it fits you. So that row gauge measurement is very important. So you want to, if the pattern is like a stranded colorwork yoke, and you know how many rows there are, and your row gauge is different, then take the number of rows in that yoke, divide it by your 1-inch stitch gauge to see how long or the depth of that armhole is going to be. Because you want to make sure it's going to fit you. And in the case of something like stranded knitting, where you are working a very specific number of rows, you need to make sure that you have the right armhole depth, that it's not going to be too short and stuck up in your underarm, or it's not going to be too long and give you either penguin arms where you can't move, or if there's a lot of ease in the sweater, you lift your arm and the whole side of your sweater comes up as well. You probably don't want either one of those things. Unless you're knitting a swancho, then that's totally fine, but in most cases you don't want your sweaters riding up or digging in your underarms. Of course, that row gauge measurement is also important when it comes to sleeve length and body length or anything like that. When it's telling you to knit to a certain length, knit to your blocked row gauge. Take that measurement, multiply it by your 1-inch row gauge to figure out how many rows you need to knit for your garment. Okay, mistake number 5 is yarn choice. Now this is a big one. I don't always use the yarn, or I should say I hardly ever use the yarn that's recommended in a knitting pattern. I generally replace it with something else, but I do try to keep its characteristics in mind. Of course, you start with the gauge information. You want to use one that has about the same gauge. You don't want to use like a sock yarn for a bulky sweater. Like, that's not going to work at all. You want to find a yarn that has a comparable gauge to the original pattern. But you want to think beyond that. Think about the structure of the yarn. What's important in this garment? Does it have cables? Do you need something where it's got like, it should have like a nice high twist so those cables really stand out? Is it something really soft and muted and fuzzy? You want to look for a fuzzy yarn. Is it like a colorwork sweater? Then you want to look for like a 2-ply yarn that is sort of grabby and grippy, and all of those colors will sort of hold together. Like, there's things to look at depending on what you're knitting when it comes to the construction of the yarn, like plied or single or whatever. But then you also need to look at your fiber choices as well, because they are not just interchangeable. You can't take a sweater that was made with 100% wool and just replace it with 100% cotton. Those are two very different fibers, and your sweater is going to end up, well, it's not going to be pretty. If you do that, there's no way. You don't want to replace 100% wool with 100% cotton, because it's not elastic, it's very heavy. You're going to end up with a big droopy tunic is what you're going to have. So you need to keep the properties of those fibers in mind when you're choosing a proper substitute. And I've done multiple videos on this topic. I have articles on my website on this topic. I will link to a couple more videos down below. I'm going to put everything in a playlist so you can just watch through all of them. So it addresses all of these mistakes that we are covering. If one of these mistakes or a few of these are things that you've encountered in your own knitting journey, then I have videos on all of these topics already, so we can discuss them further. But you need to consider fiber choice. If it's wool, use a wool and not a superwash unless the pattern was written with a superwash. Superwash is not a one-to-one replacement for an untreated wool, because the way it's been treated, the fibers are not the same. They're more similar actually to a plant fiber, because they're more slick and slippery, because all of those scales on the wool have been either coated or burnt off, so they don't want to stick together anymore like they do with an untreated yarn. That's why they won't felt when you wash them. But depending on the treatment, the treatment on the superwash can, I mean, if it was burnt, then those scales are not going to ever felt together. But if it was just sort of like coated, the coating can wash off and then your project can felt. So there is that to keep in mind as well. Superwash has its drawbacks, even though it seems like it's easy to care for. And one of those drawbacks is people knit a sweater with superwash and it also tends to grow because that's the nature of superwash. The coating makes those fibers slick and they don't want to hold together like a regular wool. And also superwash is meant to go in the dryer, and sometimes people will just hand wash their sweater, lay it flat to dry, even when it's superwash, and that's when you often see that garment grow. But you actually want to put it in the dryer to help it shrink up, because that's one of the things with superwash. It wants to be put in the dryer for whatever reason. Same with a lot of plant fibers, like they do really well when they are washed more roughly compared to wool and then put in the dryer. Things like linen and cotton, they get softer with time and with wear because that's just the way the fibers are. On the other hand, if you treated wool that way, you'd have a felted mess. So they are not a one-for-one replacement. The first thing to do is always check the gauge information, choose a yarn that's comparable, but then also look at the structure of the yarn, whether it's plied or a single or whatever it is. Look for a similar structure if possible, and look for a similar fiber content, because the designer probably took all of those things in mind when they designed the pattern. So that's probably why they chose the type of yarn that they did for that project, because it works with whatever it is that they were designing. This is especially important with seamless garments, like if you're knitting a top-down yoke or raglan sweater. There are no shoulder seams to give that sweater any structure, so you want to be very careful about yarn choice. And I have a video all about just that topic, about choosing the right yarn for seamless sweaters, because that's a special case. When you have no seams, you have no structure, so you have to be very careful about yarn choice in that situation. When it comes to sweaters that have like shoulder seams and seams for the sleeves and side seams, you have a lot more room to play because you have created sort of a skeleton for your sweater. So there is lots of structure built in, so you can choose a more drapey, flowy yarn and it'll be okay because you have given the sweater pattern has that built-in structure with the seams itself. So you can choose a more slippery, drapey fiber. But when it's a seamless garment, you have to be more careful about that choice of yarn. Now, a really helpful resource for choosing a substitute would be yarnsub.com. When you plug in the name of a yarn, if you read the little listing at the top, it will tell you like the yarn name and the company it comes from. It'll also have like the gauge information and things like how it's plied, the actual construction of the yarn. And then underneath it'll have like a list of substitutes, and start reading why it chose those things so you can get it in your mind that these are the things to look for when you're looking for a yarn to substitute. Things like, does it have the same gauge? Does it have the same actual construction? Does it have the same fiber content? All of those things are important in your pattern choice or in your yarn choice, is to look at that. Now, it is not impossible to use a plant fiber if you really want to avoid wool, but you have to be careful about the pattern itself. Like for plant fibers, you need structure, you need seams, or you need to have structure in the yarn itself. So something like a chainette or a blown yarn will add some structure to the yarn, but it's not a one-for-one thing. You have to be very careful about making that substitution. So those are the 5 big things that I often see when it comes to helping other knitters with their sweater knitting issues, is choosing the right size to begin with, using the right body measurements to choose that size, and then swatching and gauge and understanding how that relates to a pattern. And choosing the right yarn for the pattern as well is very, very important. If you do these 5 things, then you are probably going to be much more successful when it comes to knitting a sweater that fits you well. But we do have a few more bonus comments, specifically about knitting sleeves, that I wanted to highlight. Piplet says, when knitting top down in the round sweaters, I now finish the ball or skein I'm working on after splitting for the sleeves, so it's not in the way. And then I do the sleeves. First, it means I adjust the length of the body if I I run short of yarn rather than making sleeves that are too short. Second, I have found that trying the garment with the sleeves gives me a better feeling for deciding when to start the ribbing on the body. Bonus, no sleeve island. That's really a good idea. There's really no hard and fast rule about what you have to knit first after you finish the yoke, the top part of the sweater, and you've divided the body and sleeves. You can definitely do the sleeves first, and that will actually put the neckline in the position it's probably going to be finished in, because the sleeves will like sort of pull it down into place depending on the length of the sleeves that you're going to do. And then yeah, you can go down and finish the body. But there's nothing that says you have to do that. You can knit the body first and come back and finish the sleeves if you want. Either one, whatever you like to do. I like this idea of no sleeve island. You get those sleeves done, everything is done in the top, and you can make sure it's fitting right. Then you can just go ahead and finish up the body. And that's a good way to make sure you have enough yarn for those sleeves. And then if you're okay with like a cropped sweater, then you just keep going until you run out of yarn, if that's the case. And then one more about sleeves. If you knit a sweater from down to top, you do sleeves separately, usually one in another. Don't knit sleeves in the same time together, only then they'll be identical. So you can knit both your sleeves at the same time as well, which is a really good way to get yourself off sleeve island if that is an issue for you. Those are the most common mistakes that I often see when it comes to knitting sweaters, at least that I've encountered with my students. And I'm sure there are other things that we could discuss and other mistakes that you have encountered when you've knit sweaters. So please leave a comment and share the things you've learned about sweater knitting with us so we can avoid any future mistakes. And we can always revisit this topic in the future and discuss more mistakes that happen when we are knitting our sweaters. So please leave your comments down below. And I'm going to put together a playlist with some of the videos that I've mentioned already. All of these mistakes, I think I have like full videos already on these topics. So I'm going to put them together in a playlist so you can dive a little deeper into each of those topics and avoid these sweater knitting mistakes. So I'll put the playlist right there. But before we go, I just want to say thank you once again to Craftsy for sponsoring this video. So click right there and I'll see you in the next video.